Yuval Noah Harari in his book *Sapiens* discusses three kinds of humanism that are dominant within the modern era. Humanism, of course, is an ideology which places man at the centre and emphasizes the inherent rights of man simply because of the fact that he is born human. The first of these three types is liberal humanism. Liberal humanism emphasizes the value of a human via the fact that he is an individual. He is his own person with his own freedoms, his own personal rights, and as such, the individual should not be repressed by any societal institutions, whether they be the state, community, family, or any other sort of institution. The most dominant form of liberal humanism that can be seen manifested within the modern era is via liberalism and via the countries which employ this kind of liberalistic thinking. For example, the United States of America is a good example, whereby it is founded upon the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, some may critique the American project as a European or white nationalist project in essence, which uses liberalism as a cover-up. Others may accuse the American government of really just being a totalitarian, intrusive kind of government, and some may say that the American project isn't really loyal to the Liberty Project, or the Libertarian or Liberal Humanist Project in general. Nevertheless, for all purposes of argument, the American Constitution and American society in general can be seen as being founded upon the principles of liberal humanism, and by extension, liberalism. The second kind of humanism is social humanism. This is the idea that we as a species live as a collective, and hence the sort of collective good of the society, the collective good of humans as a whole is what is important. And we should understand people through their relationships, through their interconnectedness with the community at large, and the role that they have to play in society. Social humanism, of course, manifests itself in many leftists and Marxist ideologies in particular. And many socialist and communist countries can be seen as manifestations of this. The critique here may be that by defining people in relation to the society and the collective whole, they deprive people of their rights or deprive people of the freedoms they have as individuals. Yet, nevertheless, it is without a doubt an important part of the human condition, as we primarily value ourselves in relation to the people around us, and generally speaking, families and communities have been the most important things for people throughout the centuries. The third kind is Darwinistic or evolutionary humanism. This fundamentally still belongs to the humanist project. It simply defines humanity in a different sense. It believes that certain races are perhaps superior to others, and the reason for this is that humanity can either evolve into a higher species, evolve into a higher form and entity, or it can degenerate into subhumanness or to something below a human. Hence, we should preserve quote-unquote pure blood and prevent ourselves from degenerating into a lower race. This kind of evolutionary humanism, of course, unfortunately has been used to justify some of the worst tyrannies and worst oppressions in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the most famous example of this, of course, was the ideologies in the Second World War in the 1930s and 40s that led to the catastrophic events of World War II in Europe. Of course, humans are biological beings. We have our differences, races, genders, etc. have their differences from each other based on biology, anatomy, and genetics. Yet, this does not make one of them inferior to the other. In essence, in the fact that we are all humans, we are equal without a doubt, but we do have biological differences between us. However, these biological differences should not be a reason to necessitate or cause oppression or tyranny. Unfortunately, what has happened is that instead of people trying to genuinely understand the differences between different groups of people and come to terms with sort of the unique qualities of different groups of people, they've used this kind of logic to justify state oppression of certain groups, justify persecution of certain groups, simply because of the way that they were born. In essence, these three ideologies can be seen as the children of the humanist project. Now, whilst post-World War II, liberal humanism has come to dominate the Western discourse and by extension the wider world, it's important to note that the hegemony of liberal humanism is gradually eroding. People are beginning to lose trust within the liberal humanist project, and as such, we see that the left is increasingly moving towards socialist humanism or social humanism, and in fact, it already has. And many amongst the right are moving towards a more Darwinistic or evolutionary humanist approach. We can see this kind of radicalization and polarization process taking place, and in general, on both sides of the political spectrum, trust in the liberal humanist project has collapsed to a large extent. Whilst, of course, the right is moving towards a more populist, nationalist, traditionalist kind of movement, and the left is moving more towards socialism. In other words, Darwinistic or evolutionary humanism is becoming more popular on the right, and social humanism may be becoming more popular on the left. It's important not to completely discount liberalism and by extension liberal humanism. Liberal humanism, this kind of ideology, has experienced quite enormous challenges in the past. The liberal bourgeoisie hierarchy pre-World War One collapsed post-World War One, but it managed to revive itself, and liberalism eventually came to dominate the Western world in the wake of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Russia. So whilst in the immediate future, the next few decades seem to be dominated by these other two kinds of humanism perhaps, and more primarily Darwinistic or evolutionary humanism, which may be co-opted to a certain extent by the ethno-nationalist movements which are growing within the Western world. The fact is that we cannot completely discount liberal humanism. There's no real end of history, and as long as modernity, the modern era, continues, these humanist ideologies will continue fighting out for dominance. So we wait to see which course history takes and which of these ideologies will win out, or which of these may succeed in the near future or the distant future.